Michael with United Veterans Worldwide, excited today to meet with my friend Wyatt. And Wyatt and I go way back. We served together with the 411th Civil Affairs Battalion out of Connecticut. I don't believe in chances, and so it seems like God put us in the same place at the same time. And Wyatt educated me on so many different facets of military operations and his prior experience. And so I'm just honored today to have my friend Wyatt reconnect and also share some of his stories. So Wyatt, will you introduce yourself a little bit today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Mike, thanks for having me here. You know, as Mike mentioned, my name is Wyatt Hughes. I've known Mike for quite a while, dating back to our time at the Civil Affairs Battalion. They're out of Connecticut. And we had a lot in common, you know, obviously both having served for a long time and, you know, his affiliation with the Marines by way of being a corpsman in service to the infantry there, and myself being a Marine infantryman. It's, as Mike mentioned, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe God has a plan for everything. And I feel really fortunate to be here. I think one of the things that Mike and I have talked a little bit about prior to this is some of the struggles we both faced. And that was one of the things that I definitely want to share, you know, having had that service time across the Army and the Marines and just varied experiences. But a few other things about me. I'm very fortunate to say that I'm married to a wonderful woman. Her name is Rosalind Hughes. We've got 4 kids together. We're a blended family. She is also a prior service soldier. We live in Carthage, North Carolina, which is in what I call the Pineland Belt here in North Carolina. So it's not often, or it's not unoften, rather, that we don't see soldiers running around the woods here. You know, we're not too far from Fort Bragg. And I really enjoying my transition after military service and trying to find my stride, which we all, you know, look for once we do make the transition. So that's a little bit about me. I'm excited to be here. So turn it back over to you, Mike.
All right, appreciate it. Well, Wyatt, it's great to reconnect and to hear your joy in your life right now with your family. I'm going to take you back in time a little bit, and let's go back to your start of your military. When did you join the Marines? Tell me about that experience of why you went in. Talk about your transition into the Army. And then maybe we'll talk about some highs and some lows, experiences that really stand out from your military time, and then we'll talk post afterwards.
Okay. Well, around 15 years of age, my stepfather was working overseas, and my mother sort of felt like she had to join him at some point. So the last couple of years of high school, I was on my own. They took care of the bills and financial obligations, but you know, I had to grow up fairly quickly in that respect. And I was searching for something. They had convinced me to go to college. I was not really interested in that, so I partied my way right out of Coastal Carolina University after one semester and joined the Marines in between classes one day. And honestly, I was just looking for a place to go, something to do. It seemed like a pretty interesting option. And when I walked in the recruiting office, the Marine recruiter, not very typical Marines, but he had his feet up on the desk. He's wearing a tank top because, you know, this is Myrtle Beach. And I said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, I want to join." And he said, "Are you sure, or do you want to waste my time?" And I said, "No, I want to join." So that day I enlisted. They convinced me there were lots of job openings in something called the infantry. He had one poster on the wall with a guy with cami paint on and a Zodiac. And I thought, well, that looks exciting. So next thing you know, I'm off to Paris Island, where I found out really quickly the world did not center as I thought it did. So get through that, little to no difficulty. You know, I was pretty well prepared except for the mental adjustment piece of that. And then joined 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, which at the time was known for being one of the most deployed units in the Marine Corps. You know, so out of Camp Lejeune. The Marine Corps has some interesting ironies about it. I'll share one that I found very interesting. I did recruit 2 of my friends, actually 3 total, and I was told I was a quality enlistment applicant, so I could pick my first duty station. Ooh. So naturally, being on the East Coast, I thought, well, I've never been to the West Coast, I'll pick that. And in infantry school, towards the very end of my time there, I was quickly notified that I was now needs of the Marine Corps, which meant that I would either go to Cuba for 3 years or beautiful, you know, sunny Camp Lejeune, which was right down the road from Camp Geiger, where I was in infantry school. So it all works out for a reason, right?
Yep.
The Marine Corps was very interesting for me. I got to deploy to Mogadishu fairly quickly. Operation Restore Hope, which was the transition point from everything the Rangers had done prior, leading up to the Battle of Mogadishu, and then everything switching purely back to humanitarian after that. And so I was part of that humanitarian follow-on mission, so to speak. And I guess that lasted till about the end of March. We were on our way back. Everyone got a chance to meet Les Aspin, the Secretary of Defense. He was here at Morehead City, shook a lot of people's hands and told us we wouldn't deploy again. And then 1 week later, we were recalled and deployed to Haiti to sit off the coast for Operation Uphold Democracy, I believe it was called. Sat off the coast of Haiti, waiting to invade for about 45 more days. Came back, sent to French Guiana to a French Foreign Legion commando course, which is very interesting. Not everything French is what you might expect, so I learned a lot. And then had a chance to go on Unitas, South American cruise. Got back from that, did an exchange thing with the Dutch Marines for about a month. And then before I knew it, my 4 years were up. And I was not really sure I wanted to get out, but I wasn't really sure I wanted to stay in, and I was really torn. So my mother convinced me to go back to college a little bit more mature, which I did. Ended up making pretty much straight A's, got a 2-year degree, 4-year degree, and a master's degree. I basically felt like I was 4 years behind. So just trying to get caught up and really searching, where do you go from there? And to give you the kind of quick overview after that, was lucky enough to get a job at the Savannah River site, worked as a security police officer after 9/11 for about a year and a half, and got promoted into a security analyst planner position, which was very fruitful for me. Gave me a chance to learn quite a bit about the vulnerabilities that assessment world with DOE security in particular. And there was a huge influx of money after 9/11. So there was a lot of opportunity for people to get more education, training, better systems in place for security. So I took full advantage of that and then missed it. DOE has a interesting way of doing their security as far as an annual report card. They have internal teams, composite adversary teams that do some training and testing of security. And then they have outside teams that come in from tier 1 units to do some of that. And I had a chance to meet with some of them. And they said, you seem to like this. Why don't you just go back in? They're looking for people to return. And that led me back in by way of the Army Reserve, which turns out I went from a weekend reservist to full-time AGR Title 10 fairly quickly. And then fast forward, wow, another 14 or 15 years, bringing me up to the end of that time. And Mike, like you said, lots of highs and lows. And I know we'll get into some of those, but that's sort of the overview and, the shortest version I can give you of 30 years.
Yeah, that's incredible. The first thing that really stands out to me, Wyatt, is that when you talk about your 4 years in the Marine Corps, those were 4 very active, busy years. I don't know anyone in the current operating environment which would have as many small deployments back to back like you had. And maybe there are some expeditionary units that are still, running and gunning in Asia and popping across islands and things. But what a unique experience to give you the background to when I eventually ended up meeting you. You came with such valuable experience, which was palpable, really. It really was.
Well, I felt really fortunate, too. I remember having only been in the Fleet Marine Force for about 4 or 5 months when I was told that, hey, we have the opportunity to go to Mogadishu. And having, grown up with one of the Rangers in Bravo 375 who was in the Battle of Mogadishu, I was familiar with it somewhat after he had returned. We had had a chance to talk. And this wonderful guy, his name is David Floyd. I've known him, since we were probably 12 years old. And I never would have dreamed that within a week or two of he and I having that conversation that our command would get the notification to go. And I'll never forget my squad leader, Christopher Castro, who later was in downtown New York City when 9/11 occurred. He was a New York City policeman helping people through that. And, I haven't had a chance to speak to him in 30-something years, but I saw a newspaper clipping about him, and I was wow, it's just amazing how small the world is. But I'll never forget him saying, "Hey, Hughes, this is an amazing opportunity. Some people serve for 30 years and never deploy to a place with a mission like this."
Yeah.
And he was right. I mean, there's good and bad that come with missions, and as you know, we don't pick those. They occur, the way that they happen, and then you're told this is where you're going. So I felt pretty fortunate, and to your point, we were an expeditionary unit. We were part of a MU at the time, which is a Marine Expeditionary Unit by nature and by design. And then MAGTAFs, which are Air Ground Task Force, existed quite a bit back then. And I'm not sure now how they do that, but I know there's a version of that. But this is all pre-Global War on Terror.
Yeah.
And with that, the operational tempo looked different. There were lots of MUs that were Pacific focused as well. And to get 22 months of deployment during a non-war, so to speak, or like that, is pretty phenomenal, in 4 years. So
yeah. And Mogadishu, I was trained by some Marines who were in Mogadishu for the battle, and they were part of that task force. And I remember those guys were hard. I remember doing a drill as a corpsman, and they were saying, let's practice casualty pickups on litters. And you're going to feed the IVs, you're going to secure the IVs, and then you're going to pick up this litter, and we're going to bounce the guy around and see if it holds. And I thought, okay, I'll do my best to secure this IV so that if it falls off the litter, it doesn't pull out of the guy's arm. And then the instructor came over and he's like, when I was in Mogadishu, bullets were raining all around us all the time, and we had to run with these guys. And he picked up the IV bag. He's like, is it secure? And I said, yeah. And he chucks it across the room. And the guy's arm goes like this, but it didn't pop out because I secured it properly. And there were other guys that didn't secure it properly. So that needle went right out the guy's arm. Huge lesson from a guy who had served in a combat environment. And lead up to me, this was all pre 9/11 for me too at this point. 9/11 happened like the next year afterwards. So I had no concept that I would eventually be involved in a combat environment, and those lessons from those veterans would actually be real world for me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's very interesting too, because I remember being in a formation probably about a month or two before we found out we were going to go to Mogadishu. And we had a sergeant major who was one of the remaining Marines who had served in Charlie 19, I believe it was, 9th Marines in Vietnam. And it's a very intense individual, obviously a Marine sergeant major in an infantry unit, right? I mean, naturally intense. But I remember he was talking to someone, and I overheard him say something. And it was I wouldn't say a junior Marine, it was a staff NCO, but junior to him. And he was complaining, and I just happened to hear it. And I'm on a working party nearby. And he looked at him and he said, remember, the more important that you focus on things now, the less likely you'll be sorry later you didn't. He said, when it came to Vietnam, I remember complaining all the time until one day it all really mattered. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. This is coming from a guy who's got a tremendous amount of street cred, like one of the survivors of being overrun. I can only imagine.
Oh, couldn't. Yeah, that's a nightmare. Yeah. That's a nightmare. All right, Wyatt, well, walk me through a couple of highs and lows that you had in your military career, which spanned a long time of service, which I'm so grateful for.
Yeah, I would tell you that some of the highs were personal highs. I think I had a little bit of imposter syndrome when I first got into Marines, because, you get out of boot camp and you got this inflated sense of accomplishment, and you have accomplished a lot. But then you realize that's just gate number one. Yep. There's several gates. There's gates every week. There's ruck marches and, expectations of leadership and growth that they expect. And there are what I guess people would call, in fact, I think one of the first sergeants that I worked for a long time ago, I think he said is performance opportunities. So think of each of these as performance opportunities to give your best. I would say going to some of the different training opportunities I had were really great. highs, but they were less fulfilling as I was in longer, because then I began to realize there were other things far more important. And I'll give you an example. Going to Mogadishu, I had a sense of being on the tip of the spear, so to speak, like, hey, this really matters. We're doing something that's very important. And I remember picturing it different than what it actually was, so I had an expectation in my mind, kind of like when we go anywhere. And then you get there and you're like, this doesn't look like I thought it was going to look. And that's where the reality comes in. Mm-hmm. So there were highs and lows that were often hand in hand, right? So in one sense, excited about getting a chance to serve outside the United States on an important UNISOM mission, at the time, and then getting there and realizing that, wow, it's quite different than I imagined. And so there were some lows there too, seeing some of the poverty, the famine, the people that are caught in unfortunate circumstances. There's always bad guys and there's always good guys, so to speak. But then there's people stuck in the middle. They don't really have a say in what's going on. They don't have any real means to change their situation very well. And I remember that being my first experience with that at 18 years old, just shy of turning 19, and, seeing people who had died because of hostilities. That was something new to me. And, it's very sobering. And it certainly lets you know that you're not immortal pretty quickly, right? Not too long ago, I had a chance to talk to some other guys I served with, and it's interesting that even 30-something years later, when we start talking about it, you can tell that you're revisiting it. You're truly revisiting it. It's memories that have different tags associated with them. It's not just a memory. It's a memory that's triggered by smell, that's triggered by certain feelings or noises, and sometimes very unexpectedly. Yeah. It just comes out of nowhere. I would tell you that some of the other highs, though, were really rewarding, and one in particular. So, as you know, when I was assigned to the 411th, deployed to Afghanistan, and there was a village called Kakru Gosh Kane, and that was the village where 122 Infantry, Delta Company in particular, that I was working with, had done quite a bit of movement through and pushed the Taliban out. It's a very important area, not too far from Kandahar, not too far from the Argon Dab either, so sort of on the edge of that. And once we rebuilt part of the school, they were able to have classes again. Now, prior to all this occurring with 122 Infantry going in and doing everything they did, only males have been allowed to go to school. And so after that, once we rebuilt the school, there were some changes being made, and that was the first time that girls could go to school there as well. And one of my fondest memories is I was given the opportunity to sit in class the very first time they ever let girls be educated in that village. In any kind of formal school, right? And I didn't have a child yet. Little did I know that God had in store for me a daughter in the next year and a half down the road. But, what an amazing opportunity to be able to see this place be liberated from the Taliban, be a part of the reconstruction of the school, and then to be able to sit in class. That was a high for me. That was one of those, wow, this matters. Yeah. And nothing lasts forever, right? You hope it does. But to this day, I don't know exactly how it is after everything changed. I would assume things may have reverted back. But I know for a period of years, prior to 2022 at least, there was certainly continuity there with girls being allowed to go to school, which I thought was fantastic, right? I kept in touch with a couple of the follow-on units, a couple of different civil affairs officers that let me know, yeah, everything's still rolling along. So I would say that's a definite high. And I'll tell you a big low, though. A big low would probably be how it all ended. So for me in 2021, and this sort of feeds into the low, this isn't the low, but this is part of it. I suffered a unexpected medical emergency with a 100% blockage of the superior mesenteric artery, which, you being a corpsman, you understand that's difficult to get to. They had to open me up, got a 15-inch scar. I tell people I was attacked by a rhino on safari. Whole different story I usually go with. Right. But the truth of the matter is, to get to it, they had to do quite a bit. And that triggered a med board for me. One that basically, due to blood thinners and things of that nature, and I had no choice. So that was the beginning of a low point. But what made it worse was the rest of 2021, as I rotated back to Fort Bragg and was hoping to get cleared, then I had yet another occurrence, right? And so that sealed my fate, so to speak, right? I was almost off of blood thinners. Long story short, that re-triggered everything. So at this point, I am definitely headed for a med board. But in the interim, for the next 8 or 9 months, I'm going to be working at the head shed, as we call it, right? Basically crisis action team chief here at Fort Bragg. You got the ForceCom building, and then you got the U.S. Army Reserve side of the building as well. And I was on that side of the building, and sure enough, that's about the time that Operation Allies Welcome, Operation Allies Refuge, people are trying to get out of Afghanistan, and I'm helping monitor that, right? And that really was a low point, because it was sad to see how that unfolded. So many people couldn't get out, the struggles, people being left behind, reminiscent somewhat of imagery from Saigon.
Yeah.
That's what I thought of when I saw it. I'm like, wow, this is like something my uncle would have seen.
Yeah.
And I would say that was definitely a low point for me, because it felt like we were doing our very best in a difficult situation over a period of years. And, based on your service as well, a lot of the focus, whether we're talking Afghanistan, Iraq, other elements of OEF, OEFP, different things, the Horn of Africa, there was a lot of 1-year deployments, 6-month deployments, however long deployments, but not a lot of continuity across units in certain areas, right? So there seemed to be some gaps over time. And it felt like, I really thought that we would have handled it differently. And in no way am I criticizing as much as I'm just taking note of how complex and difficult it must be, right?
Yeah.
As an army, as a military force at large.
Yeah.
Especially in multiple sections of the world, multiple theaters. But for me, it felt like I didn't get to pick how I'm going out, because it's medical, and I didn't get to end on a high note.
Yeah.
And we always wanted to end the way we wanted, right? Like you're the quarterback, or you're on the football team in high school, or whatever team. I was a wrestler. You don't want your last match to be when you lost, right? You want to go out on that high. And it felt like everything that I had worked up to somehow, which was all beyond my control, it just didn't end the way I wanted, So that was a low point, even though I was not, I was thankful I was alive. I was thankful I'd had the experiences I had. But I really wanted to see a success look differently, particularly in Afghanistan. Having spent about 11 months there, and some people, God knows, they spent way longer, or even more invested. I can only imagine how they must have felt. So
yeah, well, that resonates with me quite deeply, because when the Abbey Gate incident happened, when all of the media was covering, people we'd made promises to were struggling to get out. Yeah. It was a repeat of Saigon. We were leaving on the last helicopter, so to speak, and everybody's trying to hang on, trying to get out before they know it, because they know what's coming. That was a bad mental health couple of weeks for me. I never served there. I trained units to go to Afghanistan. Sure. I interviewed Afghans on my channel here most recently, and it was deeply personal to me. The loss of life that we experienced over there, the big struggle, the progress we made so quickly, and the abandonment was such a hard hit. And it wasn't just for me. I reached out to a lot of guys that had served over there and lost buddies, and they were spiraling so bad after that point, saying, "What was it for?" So no, that's a huge low for me too, Wyatt. I feel that. I feel that.
Yeah, and even though I left there in 2011, And for a while, I thought about it a lot, and then for a while, I didn't. And then within about the last year or so, I probably had 6 different Afghans that I had worked with there reach out to me. And they had found me by way of various ways, Google searches, LinkedIn, different things. And the emails and letters I was getting, I remembered who they were. I mean, they were different contractors from a couple of construction companies and some others that had worked with us in various capacities. And I remember thinking, I was reading them, and they were asking, hey, is there any way you could be willing to sponsor us to some degree? Say that you know us, say that we worked with the United States. They weren't asking for very much. And I was happy to oblige. I wrote them the letters they required to give to the U.S. State Department and my contact information. I could vouch who they were. And I felt like that must be a really tough spot to be in, because I've never been in a situation like they're in.
Yeah.
That you're hoping that somebody who's in a much more comfortable part of the world, comfortable life, not being oppressed, happens to see this email that you sent desperately, in my Gmail, no less, that gets stacked up with all kinds of garbage, right? And you hope they read it, don't think you're just some sort of scammer, and somehow take 10 minutes and write a note on your behalf and, sign it, scan it back or something like that. Talk about being in some really dire circumstances and hoping it works out. The letters that I got were indicative of the change of leadership there. They were being hunted down, trying their best to find a way out, families being jeopardized. And, I think about my own situation with 4 kids and my wife. What if I was trying to get out of North Carolina and it was in that kind of situation, something like that. Think about the folks up towards the mountain area that, with the hurricane that came through in a very unlikely path and destroyed so much, they're trying to get the basics of life each day. Now imagine amplified to that as an oppressive government system, people hunting you down on the streets, executing people who work with the Americans just because, I can only imagine. And my career has been punctuated by 2 Exodus type operations, right? So there's that one at Mogadishu. So I was at the tail end of that. So we got there and we left in 94. And it was a pretty large exodus towards the end of March. I think it was March 25th, if I remember right. So we had came ashore in rubber boats months before, Zodiacs, mainly because doing that at night, it's hard to tell who's switching out and all that. And they were kind of concerned about that. But when it was time to leave, everybody got on helicopters and went back to aircraft carriers and things like that, right? And so it was really a mass exodus. And we left behind the rest of the UN peacekeeping force, who over a period of time dismantled and moved on, right? But our understanding after we left was that's when a lot of trouble really began. They were waiting for the U.S. to leave. Yep. And, it just continued to downward spiral once again. And when you see a place like Mogadishu and you look at pictures from prior to all that, like many, many years before, and you see, wow, there's people in vehicles on streets and some semblance of normalcy. And you get there and you open the trunk of a car that's got some guy who's bleeding to death. They're trying to get him to the hospital there. He's a local Somali who's been shot. And you see stacks and stacks of money that's worth pennies, if anything, right? Because the government is toppled. And I'll tell you one other low there. There was a Mogadishu policeman, and a few of them, not many, right? It's a very fledgling force. And at a distance, there was a crowd that had formed around him and I guess a couple other policemen. And then there was a gunshot or two. And then the crowd dispersed somewhat. And one of the policemen's dead. And you think, how do you have rule of law in a place like that? Especially with a handful of, policemen. And Afghanistan, very similar circumstances, right? You look at, what about the Afghan National Commandos and people like that we invested so much time and energy in, and then we left? Those poor guys, even if you're the best at what you do, you've got an expiration date. especially without, support, limited resources. And that's got to be tough. Those are the lows,
Yeah, and when I deployed to East Africa, and I was in 7 different countries running the functional specialty teams, the One Health mission, we came across veterans of Somalia who were subsidized by US dollars to their dictators in those countries, who fed those soldiers from those countries into Somalia to help confine al-Shabaab to the deserts there. And those guys came back so wounded, and the governments were corrupt, and they just pushed them out in the middle of the desert in their own country and said, this is where you live and die, and we'll give you food on World Food Program, and that's where you'll live and die. And it was so sad to me that the U.S. decided a proxy war with untrained military were the answer for our pulling out of that country, because it ended up just creating so much suffering and sorrow for innocent people all across East Africa afterwards, and probably still today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's terrible. So Wyatt, fast forward me now, you're getting to the end of your time in the military. I, like you, had a medical board. I was at 17 and a half years when I was 2 surgeries into my right shoulder, and they said, no more, you can't do it. And yeah, it wasn't how I wanted to end it either, but I was also really hopeful. I got a job really quick the next day and worked at Amazon, and I felt like I was just kind of scot-free, like nothing was lingering. But as you and I both know, there's a season that comes, and things catch up. So will you walk us through what that looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my case, I caught a really bad case of COVID in December of 2021. And I thought I had about 3 or 4 months left to finish all my required classes, transition stuff, but I knew it was coming, right? I had to do most of that at home by way of my computer because my COVID situation was pretty bad. And having had a friend who had died of COVID a few months earlier, once he was on a ventilator, I had refused to go in the hospital on a ventilator. And so the Army said, hey, you're going to stay home till you get the all clear, right? And you just have to do these classes at home. All right, so I'm doing them. And it's not really dawning on me how fast I'm really about to leave. I've been invested in this a pretty long time. I had 17.76 years of active duty. Yeah, I'm not a math major, but that's what they came up with. Yeah. So, and I would say about 2 weeks later, I got back to the office, so it's early January, and I get a notification one day that I need to go ahead and fill out my leave paperwork and all that. So I do, and I think, all right, I'm getting out April 15th. That gives me a little bit of time. And then a week later, I got another email that said, no, you didn't take into account this, and this, so you're getting out February 15th. So I had about a week and a half left.
Oh, God.
In the Army.
Oh, God.
And I really didn't see that coming. I knew it was coming eventually. So I went on terminal leave February 15th, and not proud of it, but I stayed pretty intoxicated off and on for the next 3.5 to 4 months. My wife put up with quite a bit. She let me crawl in my hole and feel sorry for myself for a while because she knew I was upset. I did have a retirement ceremony. I didn't actually retire, but, medically separated. Yeah. And it was an important event. A lot of people were able to attend it. I didn't really want to have it, but I was encouraged by a friend to have it for all the people who had supported and helped me through the years. And they were right. It was the right thing to do. I struggled, I wouldn't say with alcoholism, because that's not really true, more like binge drinking, and just feeling sorry for myself. I had no plan. I didn't know what to do because my original plan was to stay in until I was at least a lieutenant colonel with 20 years active service, roll over into a GS job like everybody else I knew, it seemed like, and do the same job but not wearing camouflage. Right? Or something similar. And once that was derailed, it felt like, wow, what do I do with myself? And One day, my wife, who was working out at a CrossFit gym nearby here in, the Southern Pines, Pineland area, so to speak, had heard of a program called Shields and Stripes. Shields and Stripes is a holistic health program. They select first responders and traumatized veterans, and they offer them an opportunity to take part in a 3-week cohort. That 3-week cohort is sometimes in Florida, sometimes in Arizona. I went to the one in Arizona. Most of the time I spent it at Exos Fitness Center, which is very interesting. I'm in there working out. There's this famous athletes, I won't name who they were, but there were several of them. And one of them said, "Hey, who are you with?" And I thought, me, like 210 pound, 5'7" me. I'm with the Army. Yeah. He's like, the Army sends people here. And I said, well, I'm actually out of the Army now. I'm part of this program.
Yeah.
But it was very interesting how much we had in common with a lot of those athletes. A lot of really good-hearted people. They've got great opportunities to capitalize on their talent, but they have a short lifespan in that world. Mm-hmm. And it's really tough. You think about it in our perspective. There was one guy in particular. He had been retired for a few years, but he still worked out there. And he's very, very positive. I can't think of his name right now, but he was an amazing guy. And he came up to us one day, and he's just so positive and so cheerful. And he's like, "Hey, I really appreciate what you guys do." And he said, when you think about it, we do have some things in common. And I think he's a pastor as well. I'll have to look up what his name is and send it to you. Very interesting guy, though. And he said, I really appreciate the stuff you guys do. And I can only imagine what it's like, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along the lines of the hero to zero mentality, right? Like, go from being an operator today or doing something I feel like really makes a difference, is very selfless, but I'm a part of something, right? To, wow, I'm sitting in the house seeing how many of these beers I can drink, right? And then drunk text and, texting friends and living in the past and, just sort of wallowing around and not knowing what to do with it is tough. And that was my experience, right? So Shields and Stripes, my wife convinces me to apply to it. And she doesn't push. And I think, they're not going to pick me. But they did. There was a couple of people in the screening process who, they were concerned a little bit about the blood clot issues and stuff like that. But they were willing to give me a chance, and I'm very thankful. I went out there, met some amazing people from various units. Some units, actually, while you're on active duty, can rotate you there, particularly for some of the traumas you're experiencing and things like that. The day was spent usually rotating between fitness events, mental classes that would help you as far as organization, better communication, and obviously a heavy psychology, focus as well, which I really appreciated. And I learned a lot. So I learned a lot about myself. I learned to unpack quite a few bricks that I've been carrying around in a rucksack for a long time that I didn't have to carry. And it's not that they go away either, I know you know this, but you learn to live with certain things. Yeah. And you learn to live with it in a healthy way, not in an angry way. And that was my issue in particular. Was I felt jilted. I felt angry. I was the guy that used his vacation time in a unpaid 1610 to travel to SEER school. I was the guy that, you understand. I was the guy who wanted to do the things because I wanted to give the most I could and get the most out of it, and feel like I was doing what I was built to do. Yeah. Right. And so when you lose that sense of purpose, it's tough, and especially when you then fuel your thought process with alcohol, because to this day, I've never made a good decision based on alcohol. I can't think of a single good decision I ever made while drinking. Not that they were all bad, but they were never good. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. And I struggled with that until I got there. I mostly had stopped before I got there. And they obviously discouraged that because that's going to hold you back in your training and everything while you're there. But I left there, and then I was hit with some pretty heavy blows. It's interesting, and I share this with you because it paints the full context. Had I not been there, I don't know that I would have done very well with what was around the corner. I was already in a state of pity. I was already, depressed. And I came back from that, and my wife was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of breast cancer at 41 years old. No genetic markers, predisposition, just a shock. A huge lump. Turns out it was, cancerous, which triggered a really tough journey for her, for our whole family, but even more so for her as the one experiencing it, the chemo, the surgeries. And then 2 months after her diagnosis, my mother has a massive heart attack. She's living with us, and that's the first and only person I've had to do CPR on.
Oof.
And that was hard. And, you never know how much time you got with somebody. She had lived with us for almost 5 years. And you always wish you had one more minute, one more hour, one more day. And you never know, right? So then and that happened on the Marine Corps birthday, ironically, November 10th, 2022. I was on my lunch break from the first job I had gotten after getting back from Shields and Stripes and getting my life together. I knew about my wife's diagnosis, and then, talking about how good God can be. My track here, I had 6 months of extra track here. It was running out. I had 4 days left. And the job that I got started, my insurance for my wife with just 4 days left on track here, and her first cancer treatment only a week away. It all happened so fast.
Wow.
And just talk about a whirlwind, right? Because that's a hard year. It's a hard year when you get kicked out of the Army because your body's failed you. You're angry at your body. You're angry at the Army. You're angry at everybody, really. Then you think you're getting your stuff together, right? All these people are pouring into you to cost you anything. You get 3 weeks in a resort with all these professionals like investing and helping you get better, right? Then you get home and you get a couple of Mike Tyson punches in the face, right? And that journey continues to this day. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday, my wife and I went back to Duke because although in remission now, there's periodic checkups, and she had discovered a couple of more small lumps. So we were very concerned. Turns out we got really great news yesterday. Nothing to be concerned about, right?
Good.
But, life has a way of throwing us multiple curveballs. So for me, the advice I would give people is there was definitely some low points with the drinking adding to that. This drinking never helped me. And I always tell people whenever I hear someone say, man, so-and-so is thinking about hurting themselves or they're really having a hard time, reach out to them, People reached out to me once they knew. But the problem was I didn't want to tell anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt ashamed. I felt like, man, I should be able to handle this. But I wasn't doing a very good job of it.
Yeah, the sad part, Wyatt, is that we all get into that same boat. People say, "How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm fine." And behind the curtain, I'm falling apart so quickly. And even my own spouse, who recognized that I wasn't acting normal, couldn't have imagined how dark I was going mentally. And I really didn't feel like anybody else could really relate. And so then I didn't say.
Right.
And it just made it worse. And thank goodness I didn't drink, because if I had, I don't think I'd be here. I've interviewed some guys recently who all just bear witness that quitting alcohol was the best decision they ever made, because on it just spiraled them with the struggles they had. And I often talk about the difference between being healed and being cured. None of us can be cured in this life from our trauma. We can be healed. And that healing means that we're going to have to come to a new way of functioning with this behavior, changing what we can change, but we can still find joy in life going forward, even if it's not a cure.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think I don't use a lot of Hollywood references, but this one in particular stuck with me over the years. I wasn't really close with my father for many years, but one particular weekend, whenever I was over visiting, on his black and white TV, we watched Uncommon Valor. Mm-hmm. It was Gene Hackman. I can't remember everybody else in it. I think Fred Ward was the guy I'm thinking of. He played a character named Wilkesy that was a McAfee-Sog kind of guy. You know, he was real swift, silent, and deadly. Mm-hmm. And he struggled with PTSD, struggled with sleep. And Gene Hackman, ironically, is the colonel who is basically got these guys together to go help liberate the prisoners of war. And he's trying to keep them sharp. So he's sneaking up on them at night, throwing firecrackers in their tent, that kind of thing. Well, Wilkesy is already awake and outside. He's the only one who's alert and alive. And they're talking, and they're alluding to the fact that they both deal with ghosts. They deal with things from their past. And so Wilkesy asks Gene Hackman's character, the older, experienced colonel, something to the effect of, does it ever go away? Does it ever stop? Right? Yeah. And he said, no, but you learn to live with it, right? You learn to accept it. And I think that's part of that healing, right? It's not that we're ignoring it. It's not that we're saying, oh, that doesn't matter. It does matter. It's a part of your history. It's had a huge impact on your life. But you learn, how do you live with it in a healthy way? Like, not long ago, I was at Tractor Supply. Young man's in there with a whole bunch of wooden pallets, and he decides, instead of laying them on the concrete, he'll drop them, which is really loud. Yeah. And I happen to be nearby, have no idea this is about to happen, and it instantly puts me in a different mood. I'm suddenly angry. I feel like I'm ready to fight. Yep. And it's not even towards him. It's just the noise has triggered it. The sudden jarring. And memories can do that too. And what people don't always understand, I believe, is that although they don't see it, it could be happening inside of you based on who knows what that triggered it. And that's why, when you see someone and they're maybe not doing so well, it isn't always about you or me or whoever. Yeah. It could be something completely unrelated. And I remember walking out and saying to my wife, I don't know why I'm so angry. I mean, that noise, and then all of a sudden I'm just really angry. And she said, well, that's a trigger for you. It's your traumas and things like that. And I don't view traumas as weakness. I view traumas that are ignored as a weakness. Because if you ignore it, it's only going to get worse. It's like bad news, right? It doesn't get better with time. It never does. And I think for me, and I'm still on that journey, is learning what those triggers are to try to have a plan in place for when they occur, right? A healthy plan and not a lazy plan. The lazy plan, in my opinion, for me, I'm not saying other people are lazy, but for me, drinking is the lazy way out for me. It was a default setting. Traditionally, military people drank. Okay, I'll drink to ease my problems, right? Only to wake up feeling much worse and even more depressed, because it is a depressant, right? And having an even more negative outlook. And it never helped me. So,
well, Wyatt, first and foremost, I'm so glad that you're still with us.
Thank you.
Those experiences.
I'm glad you're with us too, Mike.
Yeah, brother. Those experiences that you share are real, and they have a heavy load that comes behind it, and it easily could have taken you out of the game. And my message to this global audience who's listening today is that it's going to be hard in life. You're going to have struggles, and it's going to feel at times like there's no purpose, there's no hope. But I can promise you, like Wyatt and I are both talking about today, we've been through that dark tunnel, and we know that there's a continual journey of hope that'll eventually come, and you'll be able to rise above it to the point where you can find the light in the day. You can see beauty around you, and there is hope. Wyatt, what are you doing today to help your emotional and mental health stay on that journey?
Well, a couple of things. One is learning to be very honest with myself. I do a much better job now of saying deliberate no's versus an automatic yes. And not meaning that I'm withholding anything from anybody. I still do a lot of things to try to help others, but just trying to be honest about my own bandwidth. The other thing is personally being closer to God. I grew up that way. I've always known that path, but I haven't always exercised that path. And I have done a much better job in the last couple of years being very deliberate about that and trying to look at it as, how can I grow in other ways? You know, I used to look at what's the next school opportunity, what's the next goal, right? Those goals are very different. And now I'm looking at goals that I feel like are more meaningful for life, not just the military, right? You know, in my role as a husband, as a father, as a friend, you know, and that's the big part of it. The other thing that I have found is helpful for me is trying to reframe things and think about it a little bit more from an objective standpoint. Not too long ago, I was really frustrated about something, and my wife called me on it. She was right. You know, she said, well, remember how you talk about you wish people would understand it's not always about them. You're thinking it's about you, and it's probably not. And she was right. It had nothing to do with me. I got worked up over something I didn't need to get worked up over. And she brought up something I had mentioned to her once, many years ago in the Marine Corps. I was setting up in an ambush, Camp Lejeune, waiting on the other platoon, right? It's like a heartbreak rich moment. But of course, it's raining like it always does when you go to the field. And I am an M60 Echo 3 guy at the time, so that's how old I am, right? And I'm laying there, and it's just raining and raining and raining. And I'm not normally an M60 guy because I'm an 0311, but they got me on it. And the only spot left on me that's dry is this one little spot on my shoulder underneath the poncho. Everything else is aching, it's wet. Of course, it suddenly got cold, which it always seemed to do, which was really weird. And I remember thinking, if I can just hang on to this dry spot under this poncho, right, I've got something, right, something. And it seems silly, but that's life, right? What's that one thing you can hang on to? That's reframing. You know, what is the one thing where you can literally say, okay, all right, yeah, I might be facing all this, but I got this. Because as I mentioned, my dad, you know, although we weren't super close, he did have some pearls of wisdom. And one time he told me, he said, we were pulling up to a gas station. There was some people there begging for money, right? And you never know how to take that. It's always an awkward thing. You know, you want to help, but are you sure you're helping? You don't really know what they're doing. There's a million thoughts that go in people's heads. And he didn't have a lot of money. You know, he's a truck driver, but he gave them some money. And me being a kid with no filter said, well, why'd you do that? You probably threw away your money. And he looked at me and he said, son, never take away hope. Be all they have left. That spot under the poncho, it's hope. It's something you got. And you want to grow that. You don't want to be the person to like take it away from someone else, because it really might be all they have. You know, and they're looking for something. So anyway, you know, that's my tidbit about that, is reframing is huge. And thinking about it from the standpoint of, how can you do something today that makes your life and other people's lives a little bit better?
That is such powerful wisdom, Wyatt, and it's one of the things I encourage here at a later stage in a person's journey, is ultimately being able to give back and help people. It's hard to lift someone when you're down further than them. So once we come up to a certain point, there's a place where we can reach down and pull people back up. And your interview today will do just that for people who tune in. So thank you for joining me today, Wyatt. It is so good to be reconnected. And I I once heard from someone I interviewed, they said, someone looked at me and said, there's no way that guy would ever have struggled mentally, emotionally. He was always so put together. And he's like, never assume that somebody is so put together that they're not frail enough to fall. And
That's right.
That's the message that I take away, because I have always had such great respect for your mind, for your abilities, for your wisdom. And I'll tell you today, Wyatt, it only grew. It only grew.
Well, I appreciate this opportunity, Mike. And if there's somebody listening, if I can ever be of any assistance or they want to talk, I'm certainly open to that. You know, we all face things, and it doesn't matter how smart or tough or strong or organized we think we are. You know, there's always going to be something that comes along that can really jar you, you know, really be a challenge.
Yeah.
So,
well, thanks for joining me today, brother, and we'll be in touch.
sounds good. Take care, Mike.